They said it would create jobs for Americans. We looked at the reporting on mass deportations over the last year, and spoiler, it's not Mexico paying for secure borders. What if I told you that the government just spent $170 billion of your tax dollars to make your food 10% more expensive? It costs the United States $70,236 to deport one person. Multiply that by 1 million people a year. That's $70 billion. Every single year. We fund this by cutting health insurance, cutting food benefits, and collapsing the pension fund. Supporters say it's an investment in national security and American workers. Critics say it's the most expensive policy mistake in a generation. I've spent 10 years analyzing government budgets and economic policy. I don't have a political agenda here. What I do have is data. And I think this data raises some questions that every American deserves to consider, regardless of where you stand on immigration. Let's break it down. First, let's understand where the money comes from, because $170 billion is a lot of money, and it has to come from somewhere. In July 2025, Congress passed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or OBA. This legislation funds the deportation apparatus, but it also restructures federal spending in ways that affect millions of Americans who have nothing to do with immigration. The bill allocates $45 billion for detention facilities, a 400% increase over previous budgets. It provides $30 billion for hiring 10,000 new ICE officers, and it creates a $10 billion discretionary fund that the Secretary of Homeland Security can allocate without specific congressional approval. Now, supporters of this approach argue that these investments are necessary. They point out that previous administrations underfunded enforcement, creating a backlog of millions of deportation cases. From their perspective, this is simply the cost of finally enforcing laws that have been on the books for decades. But here's where it gets complicated. To fund these programs, the bill makes significant cuts elsewhere. SNAP, the food stamp program, loses $187 billion over a decade, roughly a 20% reduction. This includes removing exemptions for veterans, homeless individuals, and young adults aging out of foster care. About 300,000 people will lose food assistance eligibility. Medicaid faces cuts of nearly $1 trillion over 10 years. New co-payments of up to $35 per visit are imposed on enrollees who joined under the Affordable Care Act expansion. Student loan programs are restructured, reducing federal spending on education by an estimated $320 billion over a decade. Now, the administration argues this is fiscal responsibility, reducing spending on social programs while investing in enforcement. They would say these programs had become bloated and that tighter eligibility requirements simply restore them to their original intent. Critics see it differently. They argue that we're essentially transferring resources from programs that help low-income Americans to programs that fund private prison corporations. And it's worth noting that about 90% of ICE detainees are held in private facilities run by companies like Geo Group and CoreCivic. I'm not going to tell you which interpretation is correct, but I think it's worth understanding exactly what trade-offs are being made with your tax dollars. Now let's talk about economics. This is where things get really interesting and where I think both sides have some explaining to do. The administration's core economic argument is straightforward. Remove undocumented workers, and American citizens will fill those jobs at higher wages. It's a simple supply and demand argument that makes intuitive sense. But the data we're seeing tells a more complicated story. Let's start with agriculture. Estimates suggest that between 42% and 70% of the hired farm workforce in America is undocumented. These workers harvest crops that end up on American tables: strawberries, lettuce, tomatoes, and much more. As enforcement ramped up in 2025, farmers began reporting labor shortages. One blueberry farmer in New Jersey lost $5 million in produce because he could only secure 1/3 of his required workforce. Similar stories are emerging from California, Florida, and other agricultural states. The result? Grocery prices rose 1.4% in January 2025 alone. Projections suggest prices could increase by 10% if labor shortages continue. Now, supporters of the policy have responses to this. They point to the H-2A guest worker program, which provides a legal pathway for agricultural labor. They argue that farmers should have been using legal workers all along, and that short-term disruption is the price of transitioning to a lawful system. That's a fair point, but it's also worth noting that the H-2A program has its own problems. It's administratively burdensome, expensive for farmers, and recent regulatory changes have made it less attractive to foreign workers. So the legal alternative isn't quite ready to fill the gap. Construction tells a similar story. The United States has a housing shortage of nearly 4 million units. We need more homes. But approximately 15 to 25% of the construction workforce is undocumented, with even higher concentrations in trades like drywall, roofing, and masonry. In late 2025, 92% of construction firms reported difficulty finding workers. Half cited project delays. Home prices continue to rise, and the dream of home ownership grows more distant for young families. Here's where I think the data raises a concern worth considering. Economists talk about something called labor complementarity. The idea is that immigrant workers and native-born workers often don't compete for the same jobs. They actually depend on each other. In construction, for example, immigrant workers often do framing and drywall, while American workers are more likely to be electricians and plumbers. Remove one group, and the other group's work disappears too. The Economic Policy Institute estimates that for every million immigrants deported, between 88,000 and 960,000 American workers could lose their jobs. Not because they're being replaced, but because the economic ecosystem they work in is disrupted. That's a wide range, and these are projections, not certainties. But it does suggest that the relationship between deportation and American job creation might not be as straightforward as the campaign promised. Looking at broader economic models, the picture is mixed but concerning. The Wharton School projects that sustained deportation could contract GDP by 1% by 2034. More aggressive estimates from the American Immigration Council suggest the contraction could exceed 7% over 3 years, larger than the Great Recession. Again, these are models, not facts. But when multiple independent institutions project economic contraction from the same policy, I think that's worth taking seriously. Now, here's something that surprised me when I first dug into it, and I think it will surprise many of you too. Undocumented immigrants contribute billions to Social Security every year, and they can never collect benefits. Here's how it works. Many undocumented workers use false or expired Social Security numbers to get jobs. Their employers withhold payroll taxes automatically, just like for everyone else. That money goes to the Social Security Trust Fund. But because these workers aren't here legally, they're barred from ever claiming retirement benefits, disability, or Medicare. In 2022, undocumented immigrants contributed over $25 billion to Social Security and $6 billion to Medicare. That's $31 billion flowing into programs they will never benefit from. You can view this different ways. Some would say it's fitting. They're here illegally, so they shouldn't receive benefits. Others would say it's a hidden subsidy that American retirees benefit from every day. But here's the policy question that concerns me. What happens when those contributions disappear? The Social Security Administration estimates that mass deportations could reduce annual cash flow to the program by $20 billion. Over a 30-year horizon, models suggest this could accelerate the trust fund's insolvency by approximately 6 months and increase the system's deficit by $884 billion. Some estimates indicate the median American household might need to pay around $180 more per year in taxes to offset this loss. Now, the administration would argue that the right response is to reform Social Security separately, not to maintain an illegal workforce as a subsidy. That's a legitimate policy position. But it does mean that the full cost of deportation includes this downstream effect on the pension system. And I think Americans should know about it before drawing conclusions about whether the policy is worth the price. So far, we've talked about dollars and economics. Now I want to discuss something harder to quantify, but equally important. What happens when an enforcement system of this scale interacts with the rights of American citizens? Let me be clear. I'm not making a political argument here. I'm describing documented events and asking what they might mean. On January 7th, 2026, a 37-year-old American citizen named Renee Nicole Good was shot and killed by an ICE agent in Minneapolis. The Department of Homeland Security stated that she weaponized her vehicle. Bystander video shows agents firing into her car. Reports indicate she was present as a legal observer, not as the target of an arrest warrant. The FBI has taken over the investigation from local authorities. The facts of the case are still being determined. I'm not going to prejudge the outcome. But the incident raises questions that I think are worth asking. When federal enforcement agencies are given expanded powers, expanded budgets, and pressure to meet numerical targets, what safeguards exist to protect citizens who might be in the wrong place at the wrong time? And Good's death is not an isolated data point. In 2025, there were documented cases of American citizens being wrongfully deported. A 2-year-old U.S. citizen was deported to Honduras despite court orders. Another citizen, Mr. Suvanarath, was deported to Laos in violation of a federal judge's restraining order. The expanded use of expedited removal, deportation without a full immigration court hearing, speeds up the process, but also increases the risk of errors. When the burden is on the individual to prove their citizenship immediately, mistakes become more likely. Again, supporters would point out that the vast majority of enforcement actions are conducted correctly and that a few errors shouldn't discredit the entire system. That's reasonable. But when errors include deporting American citizens and the death of an American citizen, I think the question of system design and oversight becomes legitimate. Following protests after Good's death, President Trump threatened to invoke the Insurrection Act, a law that would allow the deployment of active duty military for domestic law enforcement. As of now, this remains a threat, not an action. But the fact that it's being discussed at all represents a significant shift in the relationship between federal power and civil liberties. I want to be careful here not to be alarmist. The Insurrection Act has been invoked before in American history, and the Republic survived. But I do think it's worth asking, are we comfortable with the trajectory? When enforcement tools created for one population start affecting citizens, where are the boundaries? These aren't rhetorical questions. I genuinely don't know the answers, but I think they're questions that a well-informed public should be considering. Let me also address the self-deportation component of the policy, because the language here matters. The administration has promoted a program offering $3,000, a plane ticket, and amnesty for civil fines to undocumented immigrants who agree to leave voluntarily. The government claims 1.9 million people have taken this option since January 2025. From a fiscal perspective, this is efficient. A $4,000 voluntary departure costs far less than a $70,000 forced removal. But critics raise concerns about how voluntary these departures really are. Reports indicate that individuals are sometimes pressured to sign departure forms without legal counsel, effectively waiving any rights to asylum or other relief. International human rights organizations have raised questions about whether these procedures meet international standards for informed consent. Supporters counter that providing a financial incentive and free transportation is more humane than forced removal, and that people are making rational choices in their own interest. I'll leave you to form your own judgment on the ethics. But I think it's important to understand what self-deportation actually means in practice beyond the official terminology. So where does this leave us? Let me try to summarize the balance sheet as objectively as I can. On one side of the ledger, the administration can point to tangible enforcement results. They claim approximately 1 million deportations and 1.9 million self-deportations in the first year. Whether these numbers represent real security gains depends on your assumptions about the relationship between immigration and crime, economic competition, and national identity, questions that data alone can't fully answer. On the other side of the ledger, we have documented costs. Direct spending of $170 billion over 4 years, funded largely through cuts to food assistance, health care, and education. Economic projections showing potential GDP contraction ranging from 1% to over 7%, depending on the model and time frame. Food price increases of 1.4% in 1 month, with projections of 10% increases if labor shortages persist. Construction delays affecting the housing supply in a market that already faces a 4 million unit shortage. Social Security cash flow reductions of potentially $20 billion per year, accelerating the trust fund's insolvency timeline. And questions, not conclusions, but questions about how expanded enforcement powers interact with the civil liberties of American citizens. The administration argues that these short-term costs are worth the long-term benefits of a lawful, controlled immigration system. They may be right. Critics argue that the costs are far too high and that the benefits are illusory. They may be right too. What I can tell you with confidence is this: the policy is not free. It has a price. And that price is being paid right now, in your grocery bills, in the housing market, in the federal budget, and potentially in ways that affect your constitutional rights. I started this video by saying I'd present the data and let you decide. I've tried to do that. But I'll end with one observation that I think is worth considering. Large-scale government programs often have unintended consequences. The larger the program, the larger the potential for those consequences. What we're witnessing is one of the largest domestic enforcement operations in American history, implemented at unprecedented speed, funded by restructuring major parts of the social safety net. Maybe it will work out exactly as planned. The economy will adjust, American workers will fill the gaps, and the country will be more secure and prosperous. Or maybe the critics are right, and we're in the early stages of a policy whose full costs haven't yet become visible. I don't know which outcome is more likely. What I do know is that this is your money, your economy, your food prices, your pension system, and your rights. The question I'd leave you with isn't, is deportation good or bad? That's too simple. The better question is, given everything you now know about the costs and the trade-offs, are you satisfied that this is the best use of $170 billion? Are the safeguards adequate? Are the economic risks acceptable? Those are questions only you can answer, but I hope this analysis has given you better information to answer them with. Think about it, talk about it, and whatever conclusion you reach, make sure it's yours. If you have any topics you'd like to discuss, please write them in the comments. I try to read every one.